Everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be going over part 2 of the official MMA Iceberg. I figured what better video to start off the new year than probably my most requested series I've ever had on this channel, going through the entirety of the MMA Iceberg, all the way from layer 1 all the way down to the layers of obscurity that I barely know. But before we begin, please consider a like, comment, subscribe. It really helps me in the algorithm. You guys keep on holding up your end of the bargain. I'll hold up mine with daily MMA content. And with that out of the way, thank you for watching, and let's get started. Friends is referring to Friends, the super popular TV show that nobody sucks up about, did a crossover episode with the UFC. Now, this was like the OG UFC. I'm talking like, this was young Bruce Buffer, and bro was wearing a gi going into the match. Like, we're going into, like, UFC 1 through 6 over here. And it is pretty cool to see, like, something as mainstream as Friends do a collaboration with, at this point, was a pretty fringe thing. I do like that, because UFC at this point was being incredibly disrespected, and we covered in the first 2 layers, it was called human cockfighting, which did not help its case and was almost banned in the United States. So seeing Friends warm up and give a pedestal to the sport that we know and love today, it actually means a lot. And I'll give them a little badge of honor. Still not watching it, but good job, Friends. Brennan Saaba. I could make an hour-long video discussing the downfall of Brennan Saaba, but to keep this fairly simple, I'm just going to hit you with the story beats. You got Brennan Saaba, I'm going to say promising heavyweight prospect. I'm going to be charitable. Comes into the UFC. It's pretty mid, basically his entire career, outside of him being able to KO Mirko Cro Cop. When I tell you that that is one of the weirdest displays in the entirety of MMA history, it really is. Like, don't talk to me about MMA math when Brennan Saaba was able to knock out Mirko Cro Cop. I understand he was out of prime. Mirko is still one of the OGs. And where do we go from here? At the height of Brennan Saaba, he comes off the Mirko Cro Cop KO, dating Ronda Rousey, I know, but back then that was a flex, to what we know him now. You see, I think most of you are aware of the retirement of Brennan Saaba and his career choices afterwards. Bro decided to become a comedian. I'm not a huge fan. The only jokes that I have laughed at, I found out, were stolen. And ironically enough, if you critique him too hard, he will copyright your video. So, to not get copyrighted myself, I am going to brush past this and just end it off with saying the dude that KO'd him is now dating Ronda Rousey. Or married, I'm not really sure, but what a dose of cosmic justice that is. Oh, and Joe Rogan kind of outed him on his own podcast just to tell him to retire. That's pretty rough. I wish that was handled differently. Hans Mullen. I heard of this guy before this video, but I couldn't put a name to a face. So, we are all aware of the Monster Energy sponsorship with UFC fighters, and how, let's be real, it is the most out-of-place sponsorship in the history of MMA. We have the UFC saying in one side of their mouth, we're going to try to make the sport more professional. That's why you can't have custom board sorts. But we're going to have the Monster logo in the center of the octagon like it's NASCAR. I never understood the sponsorship. In fact, the only, I like that they're paying the fighters, and reportedly the payouts for Monster Energy are pretty good. And I will give them that. But where Hans Mullen comes in is he is a... How do I say this? He's a marketing guy. However, bro has beef with UFC fighters. But look, not in a way that you think. You see, instead of being a marketing guy, promoting the product, he's been accused of using fighters to boost up his own image and leveraging their sponsorship with Monster Energy to get social clout. This has been something that's been going on for a while. You had Dominic Cruz get mad at him, actually challenging him to a fight fairly recently, within the last year. Daniel Cormier had beef with him, Chael Sonnen. Not a lot of people have great things to say about him. Even Dana White called the man goofy. That's how you know you effed up, when you got Dana White calling you goofy. So, this goober right here, Hans Mullen, not a great guy, but I guess people need that Monster Energy money. I can't really judge there. Fallon Fox, okay. Where do I begin with this without getting canceled? So, Fallon Fox is a transgender MMA fighter who is famous for that concaving of the skull thing that happened a while ago. It was talked about in the JRE. It was a whole thing. Really is a pretty shitty thing to happen. And in my mind, that is the thing that should keep that movement from the UFC. If you want to bring this into other sports, by all means. I don't watch other sports. I don't really care. But when you bring it into MMA, understand that this is a sport that you really can't do that in. Or at the very least, highly, highly limited. In my mind, if you can't juice in the UFC, you can't do this in the UFC. It was a big movement. She is not the only person to do this in women's MMA. Notice how it's almost always in women's MMA. It never happens in the reverse. Just a little food for thought. But yeah, Fallon Fox is somebody that I don't really care to talk about much more. The Reebok deal. A lot of people, when they talk about the Reebok deal, they say it in a tone of like, UFC fighters finally make it into the big time and they get a legit sponsorship like Reebok. Until you dig a little bit deeper and you realize that the Reebok deal is one of the worst sponsorships in the history of sports, man. I'm not even kidding. So, what you gotta understand is a lot of people give Dana shit for doing the Reebok deal, but I'm not relieving him from all the guilt, although I will say this. The reason that Reebok was instituted in the first place, and now Venom, is because it's part of the UFC's contract with ESPN to give a uniform to their fighters. That was written into the contract. ESPN, despite what it looks like now, actually even now, they kind of diss UFC quite a bit outside of like a few fighters, but ESPN wanted nothing to do with the UFC. They were with boxing for decades. So when the UFC's coming up, they took every chance they could get to either talk shit about it, or what would mostly happen is they just wouldn't speak about it. But it got to the point where they had Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey that the sport reached such mainstream appeal without an entity like ESPN that to maintain their image of being the sports center of the world, they kind of needed to accept the UFC. So they instilled a lot of requirements, and one of those was the Reebok deal. Now, why was it so bad? Because you had UFC fighters that this is an average. Some of them were making $100,000 off of just their swords, sponsorships that they would put on their swords. And the UFC did away with all of that and instead went with Reebok. And you think, oh, okay, well, the UFC at least made it so they were making, near the same amount of money, right? No. It was somewhere in the realm of $10,000 all the way up to $25,000. I hear Venom is a little bit higher. However, to go from making six figures off sponsorships on your swords all the way to making just $25,000. Bro. Reebok was one of the worst sponsorships in MMA. They also had this thing where they got the wrong country for some of their jerseys, and they misspelled a lot of fighters' names on their fight kits. So yeah, there is no love lost for Reebok. I think it was one of... People will say it's the OG era. No, I don't recognize it. Bring me back the board source. I like that era of the UFC. Hangman's Rope. Are you a superstitious person? If you are not, I'm going to indulge you in this tale. So Jan Blachowicz, a fan favorite fighter now, was on a losing streak. He would what you would call a can in the light heavyweight division. Until one day, bro was going on a jog through a forest, and he sees a man who has committed force quit game. He sees this, being the responsible citizen that he is, calls the cops, authorities, whatever. They come in and get this guy down. He's still there, and the cops... I want to know how this discussion happened, but the cops cut him off a piece of the rope and say, it's good luck. Hanged man's rope is good luck. That is a real superstition. So he makes a bracelet out of it. And what happens after that? He goes on his undefeated run that concludes with him becoming champion of the light heavyweight division and beating Israel Adesanya. Bro. If you're not a superstitious guy, it is kind of crazy how he went from being a can in the light heavyweight division all the way to becoming champion, a dominant champion, right after this incident. But yeah, it's a lesser known bit of MMA trivia right there. Yamasaki. I wouldn't say he is the worst referee ever. However, he's the guy that's famous, for before every single fight he would do this. And bro was accused a lot of kind of trying to be a personality in MMA, being a referee. And we all know that the only referee that can have that personality and fame is the OG Herb Dean. Yamasaki also made a lot of pretty bad calls, some of which would have changed the course of an entire fight. And in my mind, you know what? I will be gracious once. But if it happens a couple times, then I have a problem with you, Yamasaki. I think the UFC does not employ their own referees. In fact, it's actually through an athletic commission, so the UFC doesn't own their referees. But in cases like this, I think you need to educate them a little bit more. But yeah, Mario Yamasaki. Gate. I am a huge fan of GSP, and this is probably the biggest controversy outside of, I think, the weigh-in scandal he had in his entire career. So he's fighting BJ Penn. The fight's going fairly well. They take him back to his corner, and a few of the sports officials, referee too, sees that they're rubbing a substance on him. They go up to him and are wondering what this is. So the referee touches his back and finds out it's grease. If you don't know, the coach of GSP is John Danaher. John Danaher and his group are associated with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It is I don't want to say it's a major thing, but it is a thing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that they would grease up. This is a real thing that is tested. If you want to go real into the weeds, sometimes that they would bathe in alkaline water. That way when they sweat, they wouldn't be able to test for grease before the fight, but whenever they started sweating, they'd just be sweating oil. And thank God that wasn't the case, because if that was the case, GSP would have been disqualified in this fight. They wiped him down, rest is history, and he beat BJ Penn. But it doesn't change the fact that this is kind of a weird thing that happened in the UFC with a guy who was considered dominant at the time. And people still to this day will say, well, John Jones never had the grease. Well, yeah, he did eye poke more than any other UFC ever. And, the steroid stuff, but that was in part one. Steven Sagal. Steven Sagal is like how do I describe him? He's like a mythical figure in MMA, but not in the way of good. He's kind of like that little elf, that's really annoying. And as much as you want to get rid of him, he always finds a way to slip himself in. Now, let me start off here. Steven Sagal doesn't know nothing. Steven Sagal does know Aikido, and he's an Aikido Grandmaster Wizard, whatever title that they're going off of now, and does know some decent judo throws. He also trained with Anderson Silva, and it's kind of like an inside joke that the reason that Anderson Silva was as dominant as he was is because he was trained by Steven motherfucking Sagal. Outside of that, really weird dude. Somebody we need to start checking them hard drives, man. I'm not a fan of Steven Seagal at all. I mean, some of his movies are painfully bad and funny to watch. Outside of that, yeah, Steven Seagal is a figure that we have that I would appreciate was buried within the social zeitgeist. The Machida beverage. I am not happy that I had to research this one, but anything for YouTube content. So, we all know Leota Macha, right? Legend of the sport. I can't stress that enough because I'm going to come off pretty disrespectful here. But Leota Macha had I don't even want to call it a pre-fight ritual because it was just a lifestyle thing. Bro would drink his own, I'm going to say urine. I think I can get away with that. So, but this wasn't a one-time thing. No. This was just about every single day. He got this from his dad, and in fact, there's a little photo right here. Yeah, that's not tequila. Yeah, that's not whiskey. That is, yeah, that's what that is. It just became a thing that he would do with his dad for health reasons. And I have come to find out this is a whole matter of study. You know how, like, chiropractors believe that they can heal your blindness by cracking your back? Yeah. There are people that really believe that they have healed their brain tumors doing this. Now, am I going to deny that there's any health benefit? I really don't know. I mean, look at Leota. Leota Macha is kind of like a physical specimen, so maybe there's something to it. Am I ever going to try it? No. In my mind, if I have a choice of being sick or doing what this bro's doing, I'll just be sick. I'm not doing that. But yeah, Leota Macha, the Macha beverage. Yeah, that was the thing. The Trump connection. So a lot of people, when they look at, like Donald Trump in the UFC now, it's kind of like Trump will make a cameo in the UFC. People cheer. It's a cool thing. Colby Covington is obsessed to Trump to a kind of a weird degree. Like, I get it, bro. Like, I understand if you like the dude, but, like, sacrificing your own career to get better seats at the White House, that's just a weird thing. I don't think any man should obsess over another man like that. It's a little weird. But, it goes a bit further than that, because what people don't really understand is Trump and Dana actually used to have beef. So, back in, I'm going to say the late 2000s, start of the 2010s, Trump funded a company called Affliction. Most of you know Affliction as the brand Affliction. It was like the unofficial brand for the UFC. In fact, they had a lot of partnerships, and it looked as early 2000s as you can possibly look. And in fact, it still kind of goes hard, but like in an ironic sense. But what ended up happening is Affliction, the clothing brand, wanted to dip their hands in the fight promotion. And they wanted to start their own Affliction fight promotion. And that's what it was called, Affliction. Trump, coming in here, has a lot of capital. He puts money into this business to compete with the UFC. And every once in a while that he would be like the less charismatic Dana White and would kind of just be at the press conferences like, and while everyone else was talking. It got to the point where there was beef between them because you had Trump, who had way more resources than the UFC had at this time. This was before Conor and this was before Ronda. And you had Dana, who is like, dude, I get it. You can have all the money in the world. You're not going to compete with us because I know you don't care about the UFC. And the people that you employed are goofy. They're idiots. They don't know how to run a business like this. And he was right. The reason that this business did not work is this was a clothing brand that you paid to be an MMA promotion. It failed. It bombed so hard. After this, it would kind of, there was no interaction really between Trump and Dana that I could find until we got to 2016 and then the 4 years after that. It wasn't until, the 2020 thing that everybody kind of came into what we see them today. Colby Covington, the character, Jorge Masvidal, all of that, Justin Gaethje, and that's how we got the modern day Trump connection. But it does go farther than you think. Condom Depot. This one's pretty interesting. So you remember how I said earlier in the video in the Reebok deal, the UFC did a lot of sponsorships on Board Source and a lot of fighters would get paid good? So Condom Depot was one of the first sponsorships that was outright banned by Zuffa Boxing. If you don't know, Zuffa is the parent company of the UFC, and it is kind of funny how, like, this is how you know this was before, like, 2012 and any of that, because Condom Depot would pay fighters pretty well, but the placement of their logo, and yeah, you would get some pictures like this. It's like, this is an ultra masculine sport that, comes off a little fruity. I mean, like, it is kind of funny that Zuffa had to come in and ban Condom Depot and not ban anybody else, by the way. They were the first people to get banned as a sponsorship and on a board sort before Reebok. And the funniest part about this is Condom Depot was so salty about it. And they said that the UFC and Zuffa was being hypocritical because you're a super violent brand and, you know, normally that's against the social norm. But when it comes to something like condoms, you are all of a sudden scared of it? No, it's a weird image to have when you're trying to build a brand like the UFC. They were pretty salty about it though, and it is a little bit of like that fun MMA trivia. What was a brand that got banned by Zuffa? Yeah, this name Condom Depot. Bob Sapp. So I'm gonna add a few more fighters into this because there's a lot of fighters that were before the UFC that a lot of casual fans don't know about, and I'm gonna say casual fans because you got Bob Sapp, you got Fedor Emelianenko. As crazy as it sounds, a lot of people don't know who Fedor is. And then you have people like Prime Soganhua. The Nogueira brothers are starting to get into like that weird stage. Basically, the entire Pride roster. A lot of people don't really know. But Bob Sapp was probably one of the biggest monsters of a human being to ever see Pride. Bro would be involved in their like freak show MMA fights. Some of them rigged, some of them not. That was one thing that Pride did. They would rig a fight and not tell the other guy. So one guy would think he won, the other dude knew he took a dive. That's why it took so long to figure out that they were rigging their fights. But Bob Sapp, the funniest part about this is Bro claimed natural for his career because Pride just didn't test. In fact, like, it was written into their contract in bold. We do not test for exogenous hormones. And that's how you get human beings like this. I say prime Bob Sapp versus Francis Ngannou. I think that's the fight to make. UFC 300. Book it. Walker's worm. So I was scared to research this until I found out that it just refers to the time that he dislocated his shoulder going for a worm. The funniest part about this is he didn't hurt himself in the fight, but it was in the post-fight celebration of him going for the worm. You can see his shoulder get dislocated. And if you don't know what it's like to dislocate your shoulder, consider yourself lucky, because the first time you dislocate your shoulder, it is so painful. And you can tell even he was just laying on the canvas like, I can't believe I just did that. The funniest part about it is Joe's like, did you hurt your shoulder doing this? Like, yeah. And then he immediately does it again upon his next win. You gotta love Johnny Walker, man. Speaking of fan favorites, we're gonna talk about Butterbean. Now, I had an idea that he had an MMA career, but I knew him as the boxer. But apparently Butterbean actually had I don't want to say a decent MMA career. He had some finishes. He ended up being able to submit somebody. I consider that pretty sad if you're the dude that got submitted, but this was the early 2000s, so I mean, nobody really knew how to grapple like that in MMA yet. But Butterbean is kind of seen as like another one of those mythical figures along with your Bob Sapps, along with your Fedors. Not in the way of they were like high level, but he was kind of like our, like freak show MMA fights have always existed. You just don't see them now because the UFC takes it all up. But Bob Sapp was one of the more legit in there, and he made his debut in a freak show match, and bro got heel hooked. But bro's a legend. Like everybody loves Butterbean. I think that's going to be it for Tier 3 of the MMA Iceberg. This video has run on long enough. I hope you enjoy this content. And in the next one, we're going to be getting into stuff like the GSP abduction, Machida vs. Penn, and 2% African. And we will conclude that video with War Machine. And boy, is that going to be a fun story. If you enjoy this content, like, comment, subscribe, helps me in the algorithm. With that out of the way, adios, guys.